On this video, I'd like to take a look at a contemporary philosopher, Peter Singer. Peter Singer is well known, relatively well known, and relatively widely read. If you look up a list of contemporary philosophers who are influential and significant, Singer is going to be on the list. His field is ethics, applied ethics, and bioethics. Singer is interesting for a number of reasons. One of which is, I would say, that he demonstrates that philosophy can still raise questions about things that people just take for granted. And if you question basic assumptions that we have about things, and you think about them rationally, you can oftentimes end up with conclusions that are surprising and might also ruffle a few feathers along the way. Let's say Singer came on the scene, I think, in the 1970s. His first work was entitled Famine, Affluence, and Morality, 1973. In that work, he sort of questioned what are our moral obligations with respect to people who are suffering in distant lands. His second work was in 1975, which was entitled Animal Liberation. Now, he's not the first philosopher to consider the possibility that we should give animals moral consideration, but within the modern age, this is a seminal work. And here he begins to question, the ways in which we think about animals and the way we treat them and the way we make use of them for food and for experimentation. So you can take it forward from there. In his career, it follows along in the same vein. More recently, in 2009, he published The Life You Can Save. And in 2019, The Most Good That We Can Do. So you see what his concerns are. They're trying to make the world a better place, and that we have a kind of, that's a sort of ethical question or a moral question for us. What are our obligations in that regard? For us, he helps us think about ethics, which we haven't focused on specifically. We've mentioned ethics a couple of times along the way in our previous videos, but here, ethics is the primary discussion, how to think about things that we should do or shouldn't do. And so Singer gives us an opportunity to start to think about that. So that's going to be the focus of this particular video presentation. Singer is born in Australia. Currently, he's a professor at Princeton. He's also a professor at the University of Melbourne back in Australia as well. So he's an interesting thinker. He's also controversial, as we'll see. Some of the conclusions that he draws. Again, when you think rationally about things, in this sense, he's kind of like Socrates, who raised questions about things. It got Socrates into trouble, and it's caused some difficulties for Singer as well. It's not like he's going to drink hemlock. Okay, so anyhow, we want to take a look at the way he thinks about ethics and morality. And I do want to note that I posted another shorter video on which shows Singer in Times Square in New York City, walking around in that area, talking about philosophy and being videotaped by Astor Taylor, who was doing a documentary on contemporary philosophy at that time. That gives us another, not just an intellectual look at him, but you can see what he looked like and how he talks about things, and it also illustrates how he thinks about things. So let's see what we can discover here.
The announced topic for this interview is the subject of ethics, and that's the field in which Singer has done most of his work. We could say a few things in general about ethics to get started, and say that, as Singer puts it, ethics is about the basic choices we make in our lives. It's about trying to determine at least what our obligations are morally, sort of with respect to other people, how we should treat people. So ethics has always been about a field in philosophy that is concerned with human actions, with human behavior, and evaluations of those actions or behavior in terms of what's appropriate or inappropriate, acceptable or unacceptable. In trying to determine what his ethical position is specifically, in Peter Singer's analysis, he'd say ethics involves several things, and one of the important things it involves is empathy. You'd say empathy is our ability to feel what other people are feeling, to know what it feels like to be treated a certain way, and using that knowledge in order to govern our relationships with others. So in a sense, it's our ability to put ourselves in another person's shoes, or put ourselves in the position of others. So that's kind of a cornerstone of our coming to some set of rules about how we should behave with respect to others. So that's kind of an emotional quality that we have, our empathy, our sympathy, being able to feel what others feel. But also it has to be combined philosophically with reason. So we have empathy to base our thoughts about ethics on, and we also have to think about what it is that we do. And so those are the two primary factors involved in trying to determine an ethical position. Singer follows a tradition which is relatively modern. I mean, from the Enlightenment period, roughly, when there was an attempt to distance philosophy from religious backgrounds. And that's certainly the case with Singer still. So he doesn't accept that we have to base our morality on religious teachings. We don't need the higher authority of God as kind of the supreme moral source of what we believe is right and wrong. Although it's true, what we can come up with on the basis of just empathy and reason, thinking about things and being able to feel what other people feel, it might be the case that we come up with some things that are very similar to what religious teachings have to say, but he rejects the idea that the source for morality has to be a religious source. So as Singer sees it, ethics doesn't come from a higher, or morality doesn't come from a higher source, but it comes from us as human beings. It comes from our ability to empathize with others, and also with our ability to reason about how we act, and how we should act. Even though it comes from us, or ethics has a human origin, would be a mistake to think that ethics is entirely subjective. So he certainly doesn't think that that's the case, that you can still come to general rules on how we should relate to each other. And it's you can't think whatever you like and about what's right and what's wrong, and that makes it right or wrong. So there's still a kind of objective aspect, to how we think about ethics. Uh, in what we want to look at, let's just say, by way of an introduction, that in contemporary ethics, this is a bit of a reduction, but for our purposes, there are two primary points of view that are generally considered. Two positions that are often contrasted and debated, and that's Kantianism and utilitarianism. There are some other uh, points of view that people might try to develop besides these two, but Kantianism and utilitarianism are both pretty much have to be included in any kind of ethical discussion or considerations in the contemporary world. If we give a brief summary of these two points of view, we'll start with Kantianism. It's often described as a deontological theory. It's a kind of elaborate word. It's based on the Greek word deon, D-E-O-N, which just means duty. So in Kantianism, the emphasis is on principles and duties. And you say duty is a moral obligation that binds us to what it indicates. Basically, the duties talked about in Kantianism are based on respect for our fellow human beings. And respect, this is a kind of rich way of thinking about things. It comes out of Kant, but respect is a recognition of the inestimable inherent worth of each individual human being, the unique dignity of each person. For Kant, human beings are unique creatures. They have abilities that no other creatures have, and there's something about human beings that makes them valuable in themselves. They don't measure their value by anything external to themselves. In this kind of theory, the emphasis is on human rights and principles of justice. Utilitarianism is a different kind of theory, a kind of pragmatic theory, maybe, in which the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined on the basis of the consequences or the results of that action. Sometimes this utilitarianism is referred to as consequentialism, because whether or not an action is to be considered good or bad is based on how things turn out, what the results are. So in this case, from the utilitarian point of view, actions aren't good or bad in themselves, but they're only good or bad dependent on what the consequences of the actions are. You could say, one way to express this is to say that the end justifies the means from a utilitarian point of view. Kantians would say that differently. For a Kantian, the right sort of action would be an end justifies itself. It doesn't need uh, any further justification. Okay, well, let's look at a bit more of this. Well, we want to elaborate a little bit more on utilitarianism and Kantianism for the moment. For us, is just provides a contrast. We want to focus on utilitarianism because this is the philosophical tradition that helps Peter Singer think about ethics. So to start with, we can say that it's a secular approach to morality. We've already determined that it doesn't have to do with religion or doesn't appeal to any kind of spirituality within a human being. So it's secular. It's a this world approach to morality. So in this world is just in, you could say it's the material world or a materialistic, a world governed by materialism. There's no higher realm to appeal to derive a moral position from. If that's the case, you could always ask, what possible basis can you have for morality then? Morality always is a involves a determination of good and bad, or good and better, and so forth. So it's a way of evaluating human actions. So what's the basis for evaluating what we do and how we behave? And you say, and what's the utilitarian point of view of this? Excuse me. One approach, you could appeal to common human experience and say, you don't have to appeal to any higher realm in order to know that for human beings, pleasure is a good thing and pain is a bad thing. So you could say then, maybe you should adopt a position. So that's one way of determining what's good for humans and what's bad for humans. So pleasure is good, pain is bad. So you should live a life that maximizes your pleasurable experiences and minimizes your painful experiences. That's just an expression of basic hedonism, to look at pleasure and pain as a way of kind of guiding you through life in terms of how you should act. But it's in itself, that's fine. But if critically, if you look at it, one of the shortcomings of hedonism is that it just tells you what's good and what's bad for a particular individual. And maybe we want something more from an ethical theory than that. At this point, the utilitarians, including Singer, I would say, he said, well, you have to think about things. And one of the things that our reason tells us, or our intuition even, that what's best for everyone taken together has to be viewed as more important than what's best for ourselves as an individual. So there is a kind of reason tells us that the welfare of everyone taken together is more important than my own personal welfare. And then that becomes a way of thinking about things that the utilitarians are going to embrace. So the utilitarians take this hedonism, but they add this rational insight, and you get a kind of enlightened hedonism. So it's not just pleasure or happiness of a single individual that has to be considered, but it's the consequences of what's best for all taken all people concerned or involved in a particular decision. What's best for everyone? Another comment about utilitarianism is it could be referred to as a kind of situation ethics. From a utilitarian point of view, actions are not good or bad in themselves. Instead, the end justifies the means. It's like how things turn out is what determines whether or not what was done to get that end was good or bad. This is a pretty easy contrast with Kantianism, which has a very different standard of measure. In Kantianism, some things, some actions at least, are good or bad in themselves, and the consequences are totally irrelevant. Doesn't matter how things turn out. You do the right thing just because you should do the right thing. If you're a person of principle, you should stick by your principles, and even if it causes difficulty, personal difficulty for yourself, or even difficulties for others. You could take a pretty harsh example, the example of torture. There's been some debate in our country, not at the present moment, but in the recent past, as to the usefulness of using torture in order to extract information from prisoners. From a Kantian point of view, you could argue that torture is never permissible, that it's a violation of human rights to extract information from someone by inflicting pain on them in order to get that information. So it's kind of a violation of basic human dignity in order to do such a thing. You can also see that from a utilitarian point of view, you might formulate an argument which would say, well, in some cases, maybe torture is okay because some greater good can be served by the information that you get. So torture is not something which is bad in itself. It's only bad if there's a negative consequence from it. So from a utilitarian point of view, and it looks like this is just an example, of things that a utilitarian might be willing to tolerate, in order to get a good result. There's also some stories which explore this kind of choice that sometimes people make. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the short story called The Lottery. Another story of The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. These are both short stories based on the idea that one particular individual in a society might be selected to have a life of suffering, and that for the sake of the entire community having a pretty good life. And again, from a utilitarian point of view, it just kind of points out the difficulty of the utilitarian perspective sometimes, is that it looks like in order to get the best result for everyone taken together, sometimes it looks like you could violate human rights, or you could violate individual rights of a person in order to get the end result that you think is good. I'm not sure that Peter Singer embraces any of that, but it's within the theoretical foundation from which he draws a lot. It's possible. So Singer is a utilitarian, and this might help explain his thinking on a number of different issues. So we'll look at some of his positions. I think it would be safe to say that Peter Singer's arguments for some of the positions he adopts that almost without fail, I mean, they're always well argued and have a rational foundation. That's part of the utilitarian mandate is to do what's rational. Nonetheless, I mean, a lot of his conclusions strike us as radical. And so it's difficult, or he takes on topics that where there's established points of view about them, and oftentimes critically analyzes that area and comes up with a conclusion that rubs people the wrong way. So in a number of areas, his views stir controversy. But I think, again, his points of view are always pretty well argued. Um, okay, so let's look at one of them. One place where this might come into play, and it's our second point here, is everybody would acknowledge that one of the basic moral obligations that we have. This is kind of the golden rule. Don't do unto others as you wouldn't want them to do to you. So we have a moral obligation not to hurt other people. Some people would say that in our society where you want to emphasize freedom, I mean you have freedom to do whatever you want as long as you don't cause any harm to other people. So few would challenge the idea that you don't do anything which harms people. But Singer goes a little bit further than that, and he argues that we also have a moral obligation to help people. And that's a little bit different. That would cause us to have more obligations than just not to harm. There's a distinction used in theology. I don't know if it's fair to bring it in, but there's a distinction made between sins of commission and sins of omission. You say a sin of commission is when you do something that you shouldn't have done. You acted in such a way that was wrong. You shouldn't have done that. The second kind of sin is a sin of omission, and that means you didn't do something that you should have done. So you omitted to do something when you should have actually done something that may have helped. This distinction, I think, applies here a little bit. So it's not just sins of commission that we have to worry about, but it's also, according to Singer's view, sins of omission. There are things positive things that we could do, we could act in such ways to help other people, and that in some respects we have moral obligations to do so. So here there's some controversy about how far our moral obligations extend. In teaching other ethics classes in my own history, I recall in some cases that there arguments would be made that a good moral theory, one of the things that was required to have a good moral theory, is that it wouldn't be too demanding on people. So if your moral theory sort of causes people to be constantly thinking about what they're doing, then maybe it's too demanding. And so Singer, this kind of criticism might be brought against Peter Singer. But again, his arguments for it are pretty strong. One of the stories that Peter Singer is fond of telling is the story about that he's reminded of when he's being interviewed by Esther Taylor in near Times Square in one of the really exclusive shopping districts, and he sees a pair of Dolce and Gabbana shoes in the window. And he tells this story about, he gives a kind of what if to people. What if you're wearing an expensive pair of shoes and in walking past a pond you see a child and it looks like it's in danger of drowning, even though the pond isn't particularly deep or not. The child's struggling. And you don't see anybody else that could help, so what would you do? And he says, without fail, everyone will say, well, you have to save the child. And so that's a kind of intuitive choice. People would recognize that that's the right thing in that particular situation. And then he says, well, true, I agree with you about that. But then he extends it and says, what about, what if you were able not just to help one child, but to help many children who are in danger of starvation or malnourished in another country, and for the price of the shoes that you were willing to give up to save this one child right in front of you, you could save a number of children for a longer period of time. So then he's saying, then it seems that the moral obligation that we feel in a situation of immediacy, when there's a need right in front of us, we acknowledge that, and we're willing to make some sacrifice in order to do what's right. But he says that logic tells us that there are so many people around the world who are in great need and in danger, like the child about ready to drown, and we could help them if we donated some of the money that we have, which is in most people's cases, we have a bit more than we need, so we could donate. That we should do so, and that we don't. He thinks there's at least you should raise the question of, don't we have a moral obligation to help alleviate the suffering of children even in places that are not right in front of us. So you can see this is an application of what I just talked about on the previous slide. So there's some controversy about this. It's obvious in an immediate situation that you do what you can to help, but it seems less obvious to people that they have a moral obligation to help people in when there's a distance between their situation and where we're at. And so that's one of the areas where his arguments, they're strong arguments. Logically, that makes sense. But you can see that there's resistance to it, like as to how far our moral responsibilities extend. He also raises uh, uh, consideration for animals. You can say, and in this case, if you say from a utilitarian point of view, if one of the foundations of utilitarianism is this empathy, or this feeling of sympathy for the suffering of others, and so that human beings aren't so different from animals in terms of how they experience pain or experience pleasure. So the standard of measure should be, if from a utilitarian point of view, you're trying to lessen the amount of suffering in the world, and it looks like the ways in which animals are treated, that they should deserve some sort of moral consideration from us. So uh, we should avoid doing what causes, at the least, unnecessary pain to animals. We should do what we can to give them a pleasant existence, because they're, in terms of how they experience pleasures and pains, they're not so different from ourselves. So animals are sentient beings. not so different from ourselves. This is a term that Buddhists use as well in referring to animals, that they're sentient, which means they're capable of feeling and suffering pain and having pleasures as well. So that means that animals deserve moral consideration from us, and that we have to justify the ways in which we treat them. For animals, I mean, the major issues are the use of animals for food, and also the use of animals in biomedical research. The use of animals for food also brings in consideration of how animals are treated in the food industry. As Peter Singer points out, the development of factory farming and the kinds of abuses that animals are subjected to in preparing them to be used as food. A lot of that seems difficult to justify, to show that it's necessary or that some greater good is served as a result of it. Singer points out that there are other human beings have other options for food, and even if we can justify the use of animals to some extent for food, we can't justify the way that they're treated in the process. So this need for rational justification, if you're going to think of animals as deserving of moral consideration, then this reasoning process has to come into it. And it also has to be applied to the use of animals in biomedical research. So animals are used in a lot of research, and if you're going to cause pain to animals in the process of doing animal research, then you have to justify it. You have to show that there's some greater good results from the inflicting of pain on animals. Singer doesn't deny that there's probably cases where there's direct benefit that human beings derive from the use of animal research, but a great deal of research it's much harder to demonstrate that some greater good is actually served. This use of the way in which we've traditionally treated animals, Singer refers to as a kind of speciesism. That it's just, we think that because animals are a different species than we are, and that we're a superior species, that we can do whatever we please with animals. But as he points out, that just seems to be another kind of prejudice that we have, similar to racism, where you feel that you have a superior race, or you're in a superior species, and you can do whatever you want with the people or the beings who are in lower classifications. So again, because this goes against traditional practices, there's still a lot of controversy. But it's initiated. I won't say that Peter Singer is certainly not the only one who's argued along these lines, but the growth of veganism, vegetarianism, and the way it's practiced by a lot of younger people in our society nowadays is much greater than it ever was in the past. So it has a kind of momentum. It doesn't carry mainstream sentiment to this point, but it has raised the questions, which is what the Singer is trying to do. A couple of other areas where utilitarian thinking has had an impact uh, is in the areas of euthanasia and also in selective abortion cases. As a secular moral position, utilitarians don't necessarily accept the idea that life is sacred. That's kind of a religious determination. So utilitarians can still advocate respect for life and yet acknowledge that there may be exceptions where uh, life can be sacrificed or ended if there are other uh, considerations that sort of outweigh the trying to maintain the respect for life. And euthanasia seems like a pretty strong case, so that's really a case, I think, in bioethics about assisted suicides, people who have, or near the end of their life, who have a terminal illness that's painful, might wish to uh, accelerate the end of their life, and they would like to have assistance in being able to do so. As it stands now, most states have laws prohibiting that, and most of the laws are based on the idea that life is sacred and that medical people, no one has a right to do anything to bring a life to an end. As Singer points out, I mean, there's some really uh, thin lines between some of the things that are permitted and some of the things that are prohibited. For instance, in the practice of medicine, it's permitted your medical facilities, doctors, and so forth, are allowed to let people die. I mean, not to do anything to keep them alive, but they're prohibited from doing anything that would bring about their demise. And a lot of times that's a very thin and sort of confusing uh, line to tread. In the other case, in the case of selective abortions as well, uh, and Singer has taken a lot of heat for his stance on this issue, but he still thinks that in cases where there's severe birth defects uh, are projected for an infant, that parents should still have the option to abort uh, the fetus. And that's drawn a lot of criticism and a lot of protest against uh, his policies or what he's recommending. He doesn't say anyone has to do these things. He's just saying, that there are legitimate reasons or that there's arguments that can be made to permit such things. Disability rights people in particular are very much offended by the idea of selective abortions. But, as Singer points out, he's not saying that uh, in just any case, but in the cases of really severe disabilities that people would have that would keep them from having much of a quality of life. Peter Singer gives a little bit of personal history uh, about his own career and how it developed. And as he reports it, his interest in a lot of these ethical issues began back in the 1970s. He recalls at that point that in philosophy, that what was taking place in philosophy was a lot of uh, analytical philosophy involving language, what do words mean and so forth. In the field of ethics, what does it mean to say that something is good and so forth. And it didn't have very much relevance to the actual world that we live in. So in the 70s, as a result of student uprisings and demands for more relevance from academia, there was a call, to make academia more relevant again, for it to take a stand in terms of what was happening in the world, for it to come out of the classroom and sort of speak about realities of the world, address them in one way or another. And this led to thinking about things that had never really been questioned very much before. And specifically, this question about how we treat animals. And it's not really true that it hadn't been thought about before. I mean, if you look at the history of ideas, you can find uh, commentators or philosophers that did advocate treating animals with moral consideration. And that goes back to the early utilitarians, John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, even in the 1800s. Already at that point thought that animals were deserving of moral consideration. And even in some religious circles, there were people who argued that that God intended for human beings to be caretakers of the world, and that included uh, taking care of the animals and making sure that they had good existences as well. And although some people would say that the religious thinking, or this idea that God gave man dominion over the animals, that was believed by some, but not by all religious people. And so it's never been so clear. But in the especially in the 70s and going forward, there was more questioning about the ways that we actually do treat animals. Plus, the situation had worsened with the development of factory farming, and in the development of bioethical considerations, the sort of explosion of research in the area of medicine as well. So a lot of our use of animals were things that were just taken for granted, and if we raised the questions about them, which is what people like Singer began to do, it became evident that it wasn't so easy to justify traditional practices. And you say that was part of what the role of philosophy was to raise these kinds of questions. So it seemed as though this was part of what philosophy was supposed to do, that it was supposed to think about things. That in a way was, in the new era at least, an attempt to keep it real, so to speak, to keep philosophy relevant. That it should relate to the practical world, the world that we live in, and it should give direction to people in terms of how to relate to themselves and to relate to the world. In a way, you could say it goes back to this fundamental need for philosophy and for individuals in the world for self-reflection. This know thyself, be examined to live an examined life. So it required self-reflection, self-examination, thinking about what we just take for granted, what we assume is the case. So this kind of questioning was really the first step in trying to have a more intelligent relationship with oneself and with the world. This, as Singer points out, this is what Socrates was all about. He questioned what people just assumed, what they took for granted. And as Singer points out, it had a bad result for Socrates. But in the modern world, it's not quite the same thing. It's not that dangerous, although it can make life more difficult for anybody who speaks out on issues like these. But it also makes life more interesting if you sort of challenge the status quo, uh, challenge people to think about things that they've always taken for granted. Finally, at the end of the interview, Astra Taylor asked Singer the question about the meaning of life. Ask him, can life be meaningful? And Singer responds, yes, it can. So he says we can give ourselves meaning by connecting to causes that help others, by lessening suffering in the world, thus making the world a little better through our contributions, so that we can do something actively to alleviate the extent of the suffering that exists in the world. And as he sees it, that's a good meaning to have for one's own existence. The rest of this is really just my own personal commentary on it. And I thought, and with some reflection, because I'd read this a number of times, but that I said, okay, I mean that's a good argument. We should do things to try and help others in a way. It's hard to argue with that. The idea that we can make our own lives meaningful by improving the lives of other people. It seems to be a good thing. At the same time, it seemed to me like that there was something missing in this kind of formulation. And at a certain point, I thought about Nietzsche, and I thought, what would Nietzsche have said about this answer? And I think I know that he wouldn't have liked it very much. That you give meaning to your life by living it for other people, or by trying to make life better for everybody concerned. And it leaves the question unanswered. What about doing something for yourself? What about making something for yourself of yourself? What about rising above oneself? And it seems to me that should be included. It's okay to dedicate yourself to helping others, but you should also be striving to be something yourself, as kind of to borrow a phrase, to be all that you can be. You have to admire Singer as I do. I think he's a man who has the courage of his convictions. It's pretty rare to find people who follow the arguments wherever they lead and will stick to his guns when challenged. Like Socrates, he followed the arguments wherever they led, and uh, and argued for them. It's just on this last question, I think, that he came up a little bit short. So, okay, we'll see you next time.